Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. What a joy to be here. I've been told I cannot speak for my usual 3 hours, so I have to cut through all the jokes and the preliminary remarks and get right to my topic. So let me begin with a story. It was a cold winter morning up in Hartford, Connecticut. And remember that name, we'll come back to that later. Hartford, Connecticut. It was very cold that morning, and there was a motorcyclist going down the street, and the chill was so great that he couldn't keep warm, even though he had a leather jacket on, so he decided to turn the jacket around. So he stopped, took his jacket off, and put it front way so the buttons and the zipper wouldn't be in the back, and the wind wouldn't penetrate through those, so it'd be warmer. It looked a little strange, but it worked pretty well. So he got his jacket on and buttoned it down the back and got back on his motorcycle. He's going along, and a terrible thing happened. There was some black ice there, and he got on this, and they started to go sideways. They slipped. The bike went out from underneath him, and he rammed into a tree and knocked himself out. And there he lay at the foot of the tree, wheel on the motorcycle still spinning, and he was out like a light. Well, naturally, a couple of people saw it happen, and they stopped their cars, and people on the street came over and started to look around. They called the ambulance. In about 3 minutes, the ambulance showed up, and they went out there and looked at the guy, and they took his pulse and everything, and he was dead. So they started to do the questionnaire. They turned around and said, "What happened to this poor fellow? We see it looks like he had an accident." And one of the guys from the crowd stepped up, and he said, "Yeah, it was really strange. He hit this tree. He wasn't going too fast, but there he was on the ground, and he seemed to be okay. He was breathing and all that at first, but by the time we got his head turned around okay, he was dead." I promise that'll be my last joke, but I had to tell that story because there's a moral to it, or there's a lesson at least, and it's a very serious lesson. And that is, if we analyze the problem incorrectly, our solutions quite often will not work very well. It's as simple as that, okay? So we have to be very careful when we're looking at the world and we're analyzing all these problems we see, problems in the economy, problems in education, problems in healthcare, problems of spiritual values, of morality and ethics, nationality, concepts of government, all of these things. We see problems, and we all agree on the problems, but we seldom talk about the solutions, right? Because we assume that, well, if we just get the head straightened around, everything will work fine. As far as we can see, the problems are very simple. They're caused by people. And so if we just get rid of the bad people and replace them with good people, everything will work out fine. And as you know, you wouldn't be here unless you were students of history to some extent, and some of you to a great extent. You know that history is loaded with examples where people have risen up against a tyrant, and at great cost in treasure and blood. They've overthrown the tyrant, they got rid of the bad guy, and they replaced him with one who was just as bad, if not worse, because they didn't analyze the problem correctly. What I want to do today is focus on that issue, analyze on the problems that we are most of us concerned with here at this conference. And even though most of the people of the world obviously are not here at this conference, they are looking at the same problems, perhaps with a slightly different perspective, but they too, for the most part, are coming to wrong conclusions as to what the solutions are. So, we look at the world and we think that, as I said before, we've got bad people. All we have to do is replace them with good people. And we say, well, there's ignorance among the voters. And well, that's true. We say there's corruption among leaders. And boy, is that true. We say there's greed among the corporate executives. And that's true. And then we have this mysterious thing called the blind force of history. the cycles of history that we read about in the history books, where all empires gradually go through cycles. They grow, they become great, then they decline and fall. And this is something that is immutable. You can't do anything about it because it just comes from nature somehow. And so we have that factor too, where people become affluent, they become lazy, they become they lose sight of their founding principles, the things that created their great nation in the first place. All of those things are true. But I'm here to say that if I were a teacher in a college class and a student came up with any of these answers or all of them together, I would say I'd have to give them half credit. All of these things are true. But there's something else. There's something else that also is true, and in my view is equally true and equally a causal effect. And that's the cause, the primary cause actually, of all of these other problems. And so we have to take a look at what those are, that basic systemic condition, before we can save the life of this poor guy at the base of the tree, which happens to be us. So here's what it is. This is an idea. It's an idea that has spread around the world. It's only been in existence about 150 years, less than 200 years. I call it Idea X. And the reason I call it Idea X is because most people do not know that it has a name. They don't even know what it is. They haven't recognized it as a single idea. And most people believe it. In fact, it is the driving ideology that determines the national policies of every single nation in the world today. It is the ideology that is taught in schools for quite a while. It was taught to me, and I accepted it totally. Most of you in this room, even though you're here at this rebellious type of an event, no, let me change the word, not most, some of you will believe it also, because you were taught it as I was. It's an idea that drives both sides of most of the wars of history, at least in the last 200 years. Armies have fought each other. The leaders have devastated each other's countries. They've killed millions of people in warfare, and yet both sides believe the same thing. So what is this thing? Idea X exists. I'm going to be talking about that today, and I'm going to be talking about the constructive opposite of it, which I call Idea Z. Here are the names. Idea X is called collectivism, and Idea Z is called individualism. Now, these are words, well, oh my gosh, somebody else gave my talk? Here, wait a minute. It's wonderful to hear that response, because most audiences that I speak before have no idea what I just said. These words are strange to most people. I remember the first time I ran across the word collectivism, I thought, oh, what is that, I wonder? I thought somebody was inventing a word. And it wasn't until later that I heard the word individualism, and I had the same reaction. I went to the dictionary, and I found out there are very clear definitions of both words in the dictionary. And then somewhere in that pattern, I got involved in a little research, and I started to read old history books. It's a very dangerous thing to do, to read old history books, because they challenge your current worldview right to the core. And I found out that the word collectivism was a very commonly used word in the textbooks of history and in old literature, political treatises and so forth. Almost everybody speaking on this topic at the college level and below were using the words collectivism and individualism like we use left wing and right wing. It was that common. And for some reason, which you can imagine, those words were expunged from the English language. They were not used. And if they were used, they were given a new meaning, and such as the word, democracy, and we'll be talking about that in a moment also. So I'm here to talk about Idea X because that is, in my view at least, the core problem of all, if not, I say most, if not all, of the major problems that concern most people of the world today. Now, that means that all these other words are kind of meaningless. The words we use to discuss political ideology are meaningless. I'm talking about socialism, communism, fascism, Nazism, left-wingism, right-wingism, moderate, conservative, liberal. I mean, all of these words, they mean nothing, ladies and gentlemen. Democrat, Republican, what do these words mean? We all have kind of an intrinsic feeling of what they mean if we have an affinity to the group of people who call themselves by that name. We think, oh, well, all my friends are socialists or progressives, so I guess I'm a progressive too, you know? So we go by these affinities, but we don't know what they mean. Not many people can define them. And even those who venture to define them find that no one else agrees with their definition. So we have this morass of misunderstanding of what is really going on in the world. We think we have opponents in an ideological debate when in fact, once we lift off the labels and look underneath and see what the ideology actually is, in most cases we find we do not have opponents at all, that we're usually in agreement. So now, with that as a way of a preface to all of this, I'm going to tell you how I got into this and what I discovered. Now, some of you may have heard me talk about this part of it before, but for those of you who haven't, I think you might find it interesting. I became first aware of this war between individualism and collectivism in 1960. Actually, it was 1959, but practically the tail end of 1959. It was really 1960 that I began to start reading literature on this topic. And in those days, I had no idea about collectivism or individualism. Back in the 60s, we were concerned, rightfully so, I think, about communism. And what I didn't realize then is that communism was merely a variant of collectivism. And so it was okay with me when I saw all kinds of things going on in the United States to fight communism that actually were unconstitutional, didn't sound right to me, but they were our guys. They were the good guys, so it was okay, and those communists were bad guys, so we could do anything to them, not thinking that we ourselves were building a system right in this country that was the same as the underlying collectivism that we call communism. And this is where it becomes important to know what these underlying principles are. So I became curious. I started to read these books. And believe me, I was not a reader in those days, but all of a sudden I was hooked. And I couldn't find enough books. So I wanted to find out what these guys who called themselves communists really believed. So I went down to the communist bookstore in Los Angeles. It was called the People's Bookshop. Still there, I think. But you know, the communists have developed that great concept of everything they do is for the people, right? That's part of the line. And so you gotta like them because they're for the people, and we are the people. So I went down to the People's Bookshop, and I said, I want to find out what's going on here, so what do you recommend? Well, they gave me a long list of books. Of course, started off with Karl Marx, Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto. But they really wanted me to read the works of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Well, I thought that would be easy, but I found out Lenin was a prolific writer. You put him on a bookshelf like I have, and they go boom, 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 boom. A lot of books by Lenin, mostly collected essays and speeches, and many of them are repetitious. But boy, if you want to know what goes on in communism and therefore in collectivism, read Lenin. Lenin is it. I've got to back off a little bit on this because this is important. What I learned in that early stage was that there's a difference between Marxism and what the comrades call Marxism-Leninism. They put the two words together. And to me, that was just gibberish. Well, isn't it all the same? If you're a Marxist, you're a Leninist or a Stalinist or something like that. No. You're not very scholarly if you think that's true. They make it very clear there's a difference between Marxism and Marxism-Leninism. Sometimes they just call it Leninism, but usually it's Marxism hyphen or slash Leninism. What's that all about? So, if you don't know what that's all about, I've got to tell you because this is core. A Marxist is a person who's read the works of Karl Marx, and they they think it makes sense, as I did the first time. I mean, who can object, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need? What's wrong with that? Isn't that the basics of charity? We all want that, right? But what they don't say is how. Sure, we want from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, as long as it's voluntary. That's a word we all know about here. Yeah, I'll give as I perceive the need and my ability to give, and I'll choose to whom I give it to. Or I might even decide not to give it to anybody. I want to just be a selfish person. It's up to me. But under communism, yeah, we agree this person needs something, and therefore I would take a gun and I will go to everybody and say, you give me this money for this poor person or I kill you. And you give me more money or I kill you. You don't do it voluntarily. You do it under coercion. And therein lies the difference between, one of the differences between individualism and collectivism. So anyway, I was just learning all of this stuff down at the People's Bookshop. And so I learned the difference between Marxism and Leninism. And so Marxism is simply the ideas advanced by Karl Marx, which are basically the ideas of collectivism. And so what is this Marxism-Leninism? Well, Lenin came along later, and he said, comrades, you've read the book. Now we're all Marxists. What are we going to do about it? Having this knowledge doesn't bring us to power. Lenin said power is everything. If you don't have power over people, you're wasting your time. He said, it makes no difference how many books you've read, how well you can debate, how clear your thinking is. If you don't come to power, you've wasted your life. So therefore, comrades, we must do whatever we must do to come to power. And he's the guy that said promises are like pie crusts, made to be broken. Quotable guy, And so we all know about Lenin, but this is what Lenin brought to the table. He said, let us form an organization. We will call it the Communist Party. Let us become militant. Let us develop strategies and tactics. Let us develop communication lines and funding and strategies. Let us use this as a virtual army to come to power. He said, comrades, if you go into a nation and they have strong nationalistic feelings, they believe in their country and their traditions, and they're proud of that, do you go in there and say, we believe in internationalism, we want to get rid of national boundaries, we want to be an international movement? No, comrades, don't do that. You're stupid if you do that. Tell them that you are a nationalist. You have value for the traditions. You intend to preserve the sovereignty of the nation. Lie to them and they will believe you. And then, when they believe you, they will make you their leader. Now you're their leader, and you can betray them, and we come to power. Any questions? This is very clear. This is Leninism. So now when you run into one of these guys like I did down there at the People's Bookshop, and he described himself as a Marxist-Leninist, I knew exactly, after I'd read the books, I knew what he meant. But prior to that, I wouldn't have known what that meant at all. It meant they were going to lie, cheat, steal, murder, whatever it takes to come to power. All right. So it turns out that this is the same strategy used by all other variants of collectivism. It's just not unique to communism, but it is a common strategy. In fact, you'll find this strategy probably at your hometown, in the city hall, among the police department, maybe. The chief of police, sometimes, in little communities especially, they follow this rule. It's appalling. And they never read Marx, they never read Lenin, but it's one of the things that the predator mind comes up with. And while I've said that, I've got to digress just for a moment. I think that what we're fighting here is not so much ignorance, although that's very important, but we're fighting a very well-informed minority of people who know exactly what they're doing, and I call them the PP class. The PP class. Now, the first P stands for predators, and the second one stands for parasites. So there's a small percentage. I think there's probably about 5% of the population who are just, perhaps it's genetic, I don't know, but there are 5% that are predators, and they would do anything. absolutely anything to have the power over you and everyone else. And the parasites make up the other 10% of that 15% group, and they'll just follow along because they want to live easy and off the fruits of your labor. So anyway, you find that the people in the predator class in particular come up with pretty much the same ideas as Marxism, Leninism. But the beauty of Marxism, Leninism is that the guy wrote books on it, and it's so clear because you can study it like a textbook, and it's clear. You understand exactly what we're seeing in the world around us. It's taught by the comrades. So, okay, what I discovered is that when I read the works of Marx and Lenin and Stalin, and then I got curious about Hitler, I thought, no, Hitler is an enemy of communism, or Nazism is the opposite of communism, right? That's what they taught us in school. We got the right wing and the left wing, right? The fascists over here and the communists over here. I said, well, let's see if I can find the difference. And you know where I'm going with this. There is no difference. Every one of the basic principles of communism are in Nazism and fascism and all the other variants of collectivism. I began to get suspicious that what I was discovering was something bigger than any one of these little things, the communism, fascism, socialism, all that stuff. There's something bigger here. So I started to take notes as to what these entities were, and I came up with 8 of them. There were more, but 8 I kept running into over and over and over again. And I'd like to talk about 7 of them. The 7 of them are the ideological foundation of collectivism, and the 8th one that I discovered is not ideological, it's just an observation. The observation was that all of them had the concept of the great leader, Big Brother, 1894, Big Brother up on the screen. I mean, Lenin was the Big Brother, he was the big name. And as our country has adopted collectivism more and more and more, the idea of Big Brother in our country has grown and grown and grown. It used to be, in the beginning, the President of the United States was kind of a clerk. He was a clerk. He was elected by the Senate. He served the Senate, didn't report to the people. He was the administrator, kind of like the president of a company. The board of directors hires the president to execute what the board of directors wants. And that was what the president was supposed to do in this country. And then over the years, that office has grown and grown and grown. And unfortunately, it was Abraham Lincoln that had a big push to expand the role of the presidency. And of course, Abraham Lincoln we admire for other reasons. So we think, well, if he did it, it's okay. And then Andrew Jackson, who fought against the Federal Reserve, was probably the guy that put the final nail in the coffin. Andrew Jackson made the presidency into a kingship. From that point forward, the American people began to look to the president as though he was royalty. And it's only gotten worse ever since. And now the president issues decrees, executive orders, and Congress says, well, what are we supposed to do? We ask the president to tell them what they're supposed to do. Complete shift, okay? So I discovered that all of these concepts of collectivism naturally gravitate to the great leader concept. Apparently there's something innate in the human being that they like that. They follow the leader because they want a leader. So anyway, that was merely an observation. It may be that with the rise of technology today, or technocracy as they like to call it, it may be that they're going to try and convince us that we now have a system which has no leader. That's kind of the mantra you hear coming out now. A leaderless society. We can depend on the computers to make wise decisions, but they don't tell us who's going to program the computers. So that's where we are with that. But anyway, put that 8th one aside. You have 7 principles of belief. And I'd like to talk about those now. All right. First thing is the origin of human rights. We talk about rights. What are rights and where do they come from? Well, the first place is where they come from. The individualist believes that rights come with the human, that we're born with them. Some people like to say they're God-given rights. Others are a little nervous with that phrase, and so they say, well, maybe yes, maybe no, but we're born with them. They're intrinsic rights. They're hardware, in other words, instead of software. They come with us. They're hardwired. And so most people in this room, I imagine, would feel that way about it, because if the government can give you your rights, then they have the power, it has the power to take them away from you. And that's the concept of collectivism. Every collectivist system you will ever find is very clear about this. You have rights that come from the state, and they grant you your rights if you are good boys and girls. If you do exactly as you're supposed to do, then you have rights. But if you step out of line in any way that your rulers say you shouldn't have done, they take your rights away from you. And that is one of the core beliefs that everybody in the world has accepted kind of mindlessly, and that is that rights come from the state. And if you doubt that, just take a look at the declarations, not the declarations, the constitutions of all the collectivist systems of the world, except the United States. The United States makes it very clear that the rights come from, well, they say for God right there, right there in the Declaration of Independence, these God-given rights. Intrinsic, inalienable, or unalienable, however you want to pronounce it. They're hardwired. But all the others where they deal with this issue, they say the rights are granted by the state. Take a look at the United Nations Draft Covenant on Human Rights. Big, thick document. Glorious to read that. By the way, it's almost a blueprint of the original document of that kind, which appeared as the Soviet Union Constitution. If you go down to the People's Bookshop on Larchmont, you buy a copy of the Soviet Union Constitution. I think they probably have some copies still there. And you will read almost word for word exactly what's in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which is that you, the people, have a right to do everything and anything. It's wonderful. They have rights in there that you never even heard about. Rights in there that are not in the American Constitution. There are rights everywhere, including the right of religion, freedom of religion and peaceful assembly and to speak your mind, freedom of speech. All of that is in there. Right to a job. But if you read it further, get past all those glorious phrases, you come to a sort of a comma. I guess in most cases there's a comma. And then there's the word except. Oh, except. What do you mean except? Well, read further. Except as may be provided for by law. Well, that sounds reasonable, doesn't it? You've got rights unless they pass a law that says you don't have rights. Well, you never had them in the first place then, did you? If they could simply pass a law, raise their hand, take away your rights, you never had them. So this is intrinsic. This is something we have to know. And how many people think the United Nations is a wonderful solution to the world's problems, you see? And here that on this first principle of collectivism versus individualism, the UN is dedicated totally to collectivism. So you get prepared for the rest of this, okay? Okay, that's one of the distinctions I found. The next one was the supremacy question. Which is supreme in society, the individual or the group? Well, that's an interesting question because in school I was taught it was the group. I was taught one of the basic tenets of collectivism. Collectivists believe that the group is more important than the individual because it's just that way. It's a question of numbers. That's democracy. And the individual must be sacrificed, if necessary, for the greater good of the greater number. You ever hear that phrase? Sure. Sounds good, doesn't it? Well, let's follow that. First of all, what is the group? Can you see a group? Not really. You can see individuals, but you cannot see a group. You can see a lot of individuals, but a group is an abstraction in the mind. It's a mathematical concept. It means many individuals, but you cannot see a group. You can only see individuals, many of them, and when you get that image, we call that image a group. You cannot touch a group. You can touch individuals. Like a forest. You cannot see a forest. You can see trees. You cannot cut down a forest. You can cut down trees, all of that. The word group is kind of a trick. It's an abstraction, a mathematical concept. And if we honestly believe, that an abstraction has rights that are superior to something that is real, like a real human being, we made a horrible mistake, because that means someone can come along and to say, I speak for the group. I speak for the people, you see? And then they can proclaim any atrocity they wish because it's for the greater good of the greater number. And when you look at all of the great atrocities of recent history, they're all committed in the name of the greater good of the greater number. Too bad we had to slaughter all those people, but look how many we saved. The sort of thing, the rationale. No time to go into it here, but someday I'd like to come back and tell you about Pearl Harbor. Perfect example. The leaders in Washington knew full well that the Japanese were going to attack and made everything possible for them to do it without obstacle. And then they sacrificed the lives of a couple of thousand men in uniform and some civilians so that the American forces could be attacked in a vicious surprise attack, which was no surprise, so they could then jump into the war as victims rather than aggressors. It's always done in the greater good of the greater number sort of thing. And later, after the war, many years later, some of the people who were actually involved in that decision said, well, yeah, that's true, we did do that, but you know, look how many lives we saved, because otherwise we would have gotten into the war later and it would have been harder to win. They justified lying. They justified killing their own citizens. They justified anything in the name of the greater good for the greater number. And once you get onto that trick, you'll never be fooled again. So, the individualist says, no, there's no such thing as a group. Only the individual counts. I mean, what happened to this concept then of democracy? What about that democracy must rule? Well, there's one of those words that needs to be defined. What is democracy? Is it so hot? Well, let me read something to you. I'll tell you one thing. Our founding fathers didn't like democracy very well, and many thinkers around the world. We take this quote here from Samuel Adams, okay? One of the founding fathers. He said, this is colonial America now. Democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There was never a democracy that did not commit suicide. In England, we have Lord Acton, who wrote, the one pervading evil of democracy is the tyranny of the party that succeeds by force or fraud in carrying elections. And I think the best quote of all comes from this professor at the University of Edinburgh, Alexander Tyler. And he said, a democracy is always temporary in nature. It simply cannot exist as a permanent form of government. A democracy will continue to exist up until the time that voters discover that they can vote themselves generous gifts from the public treasury. From that moment on, the majority always vote for the candidates who promise the most benefits from the public treasury, with the result that every democracy will finally collapse due to loose fiscal policy, usually followed by a dictatorship. And there, and so forth. So what is this thing, democracy, that we are supposed to revere? And we fight wars for democracy, right? Unfortunately, we do, because we don't really know what we're fighting for. Democracy. Here's a guy hanging on the end of a rope. It's a lynch mob in action. A lynch mob. Well, there's only one dissenting vote. So let's count the votes. That's democracy in action. Lynch mobs are perfectly democratic, aren't they? Well, wait a minute. We stop to think about the individual. What about the individual that's being hung or harmed because he has committed no crime at all? He's innocent. Isn't he due a trial by a jury of his peers? Not under democracy, he's not. It's whatever the majority votes for. If the majority wants a trial by his peers, okay. If the majority doesn't want a trial by his peers, okay, you see. So we have to stop and think, well, wait a minute. Is there a system that limits the rule or the power of the majority? And there is. Historically, at least when the Constitution of the United States was drafted, it was called a republic. There was a difference. And they wrote about that difference in their letters and in their when they wrote for like the additions to the Federalist Papers and the debates in Congress. They used the word republic as opposed to democracy. Nobody cared for democracy in those days, and they said that a republic was a democracy with limits on the power of the majority. Now we got a different animal. When you limit the power of the majority, you do not have a pure democracy anymore. You have what traditionally used to be called a republic. So it made no difference if you had a majority vote or not. There were certain things that were written down as a constitutional law that prohibited them from happening. It made no difference how many votes you had. You could not take away the right of one individual. The individual was supreme. And the purpose of the state, as said in the American Declaration, we hold these rights to be we're going to defend the right, they said in the Declaration of Independence, we're going to defend the life, liberty, and property of the citizens. Against what? Against the majority. Read the the Bill of Rights. You have the right to speak, regardless of what Congress says. Congress shall pass no law. Congress representing the people, the majority. Congress shall pass not except, but no law to take away your freedom of speech or right to assemble or bear arms. So here's a huge difference, and they don't teach this in school. I never heard about it till I started to read some of these old textbooks that used words I had to look up in the dictionary to figure out what it meant. A republic, what really is that? In my age and your age, a republic, anybody can call themselves a Republic of China, right? This is not a republic at all. It's a socialist dictatorship. That's what it is. It's collectivism. So anyway, let me move on. That's one of the other differences, that an individualist believes that the individual is the core of society and the thing to protect, and the collectivist believes that the group is more important than the individual. I came to understand that in protecting the rights of the individual, that is the greater good of the greater number. And so these people that are chasing after this greater good of the greater number can achieve it, but they can achieve it only through individualism. Okay, I have to move along. The next element is coercion versus freedom. Oh boy. One good way to tell a collectivist is to watch how he reacts to challenges or things that annoy him. While he was alive, had a very good friend, next door neighbor. We got along just fine until we got on topics like this, which we usually avoided. But he was a good guy, but he'd be walking down the street, and if he'd see a cigarette on the ground, first thing he would say is that there ought to be a law. If somebody dressed indecently, there ought to be a law, No matter what it is that upset him, that he didn't like, there ought to be a law. He was a collectivist from toe to head. He wanted to have the force of the government to make the world exactly like he wanted it. And if you didn't go along with it, off with your head. Yeah, that's the way it was. But he never thought it all the way through. That's the way he just came out of Germany, actually, but I'm not saying that was German. It just happened to be Paul. But he had that bullheadedness of a German, which I got some German in me too, so I'm talking about myself. But anyway, so collectivism is the concept that if something is worth doing, it's worth forcing people to do, whether they want to or not. Individualism is the concept that we ought to do certain things, but we shouldn't force them to do anything under coercion, except for certain things that I'll mention further along. There is an exception, and I think you'll all agree to it, but it's very, very narrow. But with that exception aside, you can't force people to do anything. Let me back off here. Where does government get its power? This is an important concept. In our world, we like to think that government derives its power from the people. There's that word again. In the old days, the government got its power simply through military conquest, right? If you conquer by the sword, that's the source of your power. Simple. Nobody has any trouble understanding that one. But then along comes Thoreau, and along comes the Enlightenment, along comes Karl Marx, along comes this concept of the people should really, government should be for the people, right? And that caught on. The world liked that idea, naturally. And many of them today still think we have that because we vote, but we don't. But the idea, nevertheless, is a very strong idea. And so if we accept the idea that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed, then we have to think, well, what is government? Or let's call it the state. What is the state? And that is the legalized use of force, legalized use of coercion. And by legal in this sense, it means that the people in the state generally, as a group, as a culture, or a nation, they agree to it. There may be plenty of disagreement, but in general, there's agreement that, okay, the state is allowed to use force for certain things. And so what are those things? Well, if the state gets its power from the people, the question then becomes, what do we as individuals have a right to use force for? And okay, I've got to come back to those things I was going to put off till later, so now I'm face to face with it, so I have to go into it. So what can we use force for? What can you logically use force against me for? I cannot go to my next door neighbor with a gun and say, you cannot open your store on Sunday, or I will kill you. Obviously. And yet, people think they can vote for some guy who can then pass a law that will tell that guy, you cannot open your store on Sunday or we will kill you or imprison you or something. So where did this politician get the power? Well, from our vote, but we didn't have the power to give him. So if you follow this logically, the only things that the legitimate state has a right to use coercion for are the things that we can't. So the question is, what can you use coercion for? Well, you certainly have a right to kill someone, don't you? If they're trying to take your life, yeah. Now, there are people who might argue against that, but not many. Yeah, if somebody's trying to kill you, it's self-defense. If someone's trying to enslave you, put you in chains, it's the same thing as killing you. They want your life. So you can defend your freedom. And many of us believe that property is the key to freedom. You can't have freedom without property. We think property is something you should be able to defend also. So those are the three things. You can use violence for three things, but nothing more. I have yet to hear any argument that you have a right to use violence against somebody just because you prefer that they act in a certain way. But on these three things, most people agree we have a right to use violence. And therefore, we can vote for a candidate or transfer our power for self-defense to the state. But that's it. So now we come back to this thing, majority rule and this coercion versus freedom. So back to the individualist. The individualist says, for example, let me give the collectivist example first. It's more interesting. The collectivist says, seatbelts are very good. You should wear seatbelts. Seatbelts, if you don't wear them, you could get killed, could be injured. So therefore, let us pass a law, and you must wear seatbelts. It's for your own good. And we say so. And so, there you go. That's collectivism. Now, individualism would say seatbelts are good. They're very good. You can be injured without wearing your seatbelts. Look, I wear my seatbelt, see? Won't you please wear your seatbelt? It's a good thing to do. And I might even contribute some money to do a documentary film that we can show in schools to show people and the kids the value of seatbelts. But I would never vote for coercion to force people to wear seatbelts because it's contrary to the principles of the origin of human rights and the origin of power. I have to move along quickly. Property rights. I've mentioned it a couple of times. A lot of people say, yeah, I'm all for property rights, but there's not too clear on it because there's some very interesting arguments against property rights. At least they seem to be arguments. You can't own the earth. It was here before you. It's going to be here after you're gone and so forth. But I've discovered that I had trouble with that one for a long time because I didn't understand what the word ownership means. Ownership is one of those words, like so many, they have different meanings in the dictionary, and you get fixated on one meaning and forget that there are other meanings of ownership. And in the case of property of the kind we're talking about, land, things of value, I'm not talking about pencils. I mean, that's property, but no, I'm talking about things that relate to your survival, to your well-being, your land, your storehouse of value, your savings, what you need in order to be independent, so you don't have to depend on the state or on a corporation or on a rich uncle, or you can be independent only if you have property. If you don't have access to food, shelter, and all of that, you have to beg to somebody to take care of you, and so those are the very people who do not want you to have property. And you look at the manifestos of all of the collectivist systems of the world, one of the primary tenets is the abolition of private property. And that's the very reason, is because they want you dependent on the state, on them, so that you cannot you can't do anything without them. But yet there's still arguments, well, you can't own anything like the earth and the water. And that's not the kind of ownership that you're talking about under under the issue of individualism and collectivism. Ownership, in the sense that we're discussing it, merely means the legal right to have access to it and the exclusive right to it. Notice I said the legal right, and that leads to a question, well, who writes the laws? And we have to admit that in every culture there is a different understanding of this concept of property. And even though I have a very strong feeling about property and being necessary for personal independence, I do not feel that I have a right to go into some other culture where they do not have that concept and tell them they must adopt it, even though I think it is good for them. Otherwise, I'd be violating my own principles, wouldn't I? So we have to recognize that in different cultures and in different nationalities, there are different understandings of who has a right for exclusive access to the land and to the minerals and to all kinds of private property. Now, this comes to the question, we have to sort of choose in our mind which concept we like, and we have to defend that. It's not fair. I don't think it's right to say, well, all concepts are equal. Maybe they are, but in my view, they're not. I have a favorite. I like the one where freedom is important. I don't like the one where freedom isn't even mentioned, or it's a concept that's not even understood. I've been in primitive cultures. I visited them where they don't understand the word freedom. They don't understand the word property. They don't have property, not even clothes. I won't mention which one, but I was there and I saw, they told me, I said, how do you decide what clothes to wear when you get up in the morning? First up, best dressed. That was it. They're happy with that. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, that's terrible. First up, best dressed. Well, that means that nobody has anything good to wear. Nobody. Because nobody has any incentive to have good things to wear, because somebody's going to get it before they do anyway. So my point is that we have to respect the culture. We may try and show a better way, but we cannot say this is the way it must be, and we're going to have a law in our culture that outlaws it and all that sort of thing. So the idea is that ownership merely is the legal right, according to our culture, to have unlimited or exclusive access to a piece of land. And we don't have time for all of that, but I think when you delve into it, that you'll find that right comes from added value. If you come across a piece of land that's just land and dirt and trees and maybe water, it's not yours. You have no claim over it. But if you till the soil and plant seeds and clear the forest and build a house on it and that sort of thing, you have added your human effort. You have made it, you've given it human value. And once you give something value, you have this, I believe, in a free society, you have the right, the legal right to have exclusive access to it. Now, it's more complicated than that, understandable, but that's the basic concept. And so there's more to be said on property. I'm leaving something else out. Oh, one more thing, yes. There's a very interesting book called Territorial Imperative by Robert Ardrey. That opened my eyes more than anything. People who argue against private property are not aware that not just humans, but all higher species in the world have an instinct for private property. It comes genetically encoded in us. And you may say that's bad, but it's there, and it's there probably for a reason, no doubt, for survival purposes. And it's there. And the Marxists think that they're going to engineer that out of the human race. They just breed it out or scare it out or educate it out or something. But it's genetically encoded at the moment. And I think it's part of being a human. And the thing about this book, the Territorial Imperative, is to show not only is this a universal instinct, but in every case, it turns out to be a beneficial instinct for the participants in that species, not just for survival, but for social order and all that kind of thing. It's I wish I had more time to tell you some little anecdotes. Well, I'll tell you one little one that kind of made me laugh. There was this guy visited these remote lands and studied these animal kingdoms. He's one of these guys that sleeps out in the forest, and he'll be out there for a year taking pictures and taking notes. How many cows come through, and how many birds land, what the color they are. One of those guys. And so he's got all these notes, and he was telling about there was one herd of some animals, and I've forgotten what they were, but they're kind of like small deer, not on the North American continent. And they had this clearing in the woods, which was their mating ground. And every year at the same time, the males would come into this field first, and there were little mounds of grass all around this. I think it was probably about 20 acres or something like that. Little mounds of really green grass. And the males would come back and take a position on one of those mounds, the one that they had last year. They all knew which one was theirs. Unless one of the older males was challenged by a new buck that didn't have a mound. And so they have a little contest, and one or the other would have to leave. And so now comes a time when all the males are on these mounds of grass, and then the females are over there. They're watching this whole thing, checking it all out, and when all the rutting is over, then they come in and sort of walk around, look around, and they pick the mound that they want to be on. And some of the mounds do pretty well. They might have 2 or 3 or more females, you know. And some of these guys over there say, "Hey, over here, here's my mound." See? And so this happens. It was their territory, in other words. Territory was very important. But the reason I'm telling you this story is because his line, the author's line, is that it says that even here, he said the females weren't too fussy about which mound they chose, or which mate they chose, as long as it was at a good address. I just thought that was very good. Anyway, and I think what comes out of all that is that when you study these species, you find things that are kind of precursors of human instincts too. And they're there for a reason. And the desire for private property is inbred into all of us. And I think if individualists who believe that you can channel that desire for private property into positive goals, it's not selfishness, but if you build a big factory, you build it because you want to make a lot of money. But maybe though that's not your goal, you create a lot of jobs. And you create products that are now cheaper than they were before. So even though you're a selfish so-and-so, you can't help yourself in a free economy. You do things that are for the benefit of other people. Okay, I'll move along. All right. Oh, here's a quick one. Money without coercion. Money. All collectivist systems want control of the money system. They want what they call a central bank. They want, basically what they want is for the state to control the issuance of the money system, and it must not be backed by gold or silver or anything that would limit the issuance of money, because they want to be able to create it out of nothing. They want to be able to determine who gets it, who doesn't get it. If it's loaned, they want to determine what the interest rate is on it, because they want to control people economically as well as through propaganda and ideas and through coercion. So in every collectivist system you see where you must get rid of private money. They all hate gold and silver or anything else. It'll be interesting to see how this shakes out with cryptocurrencies, but I'm a little worried about that, because I see cryptocurrencies as possibly being the answer to their dream to have a cashless society. And they see it that way too, as you probably have been hearing at this conference. Most of the big banks and the governments are feverishly working in the background trying to monopolize the development of cryptocurrencies. Why? Because they hope to control the issuance and circulation of money. So individualists don't like that idea. They don't want to be controlled in any way by the state. And so individualists believe in what we call a sound money, which is backed by something of intrinsic value that takes human effort to create. And it's as simple as that. If your money is basically something that takes human effort to create, I don't care whether it's gold or silver or shoes or eyeglasses or bottles of cheap white wine, I don't care what it is. As long as it takes human effort to produce, it can serve pretty well as a basis for the currency, because you're exchanging it for other things that take human effort to produce. And there's a way of evaluating the relative value of the two things. In every society that's had money backed by something of intrinsic value, the purchasing power has remained stable over long periods of time. But once it's broken away from something of intrinsic value, that's when it goes through the roof. So that's number 5. Boy, I've got to start really rolling now. Number 6, equality versus inequality under the state. Everybody gives lip service to the idea that everybody should be treated equally under law, right? Your neighbor agrees to that. Do you believe that everybody should be treated equally under law? Your neighbor will say, sure I do. And you might ask him to point to a law that does that. It'll be hard. I'm going to guess that about 95 or maybe 98% of all the laws written are written specifically to treat people differently under the law, to move wealth from one side to the other, to give advantage to one side or the other, to punish somebody. Most of the laws are written to violate this principle. And if we just followed that principle alone, it probably would solve a huge number of our problems. You can guess which side the collectivists are on. They want inequality. They want to change society. They're not willing to let society run things. They want to run society. And so they write laws specifically to treat people differently. Individualists really believe in that principle. And finally, there's what I call the catch-all issue. If you're confused on anything else, these other 6 issues, if you're wondering which way to go in making a decision, this one is the proper role of the state. This will clear it up. We've already talked about we only have the right to delegate the use of coercion in the defense of life, liberty, or property. That is the proper function of the state. Now, I don't care whether you call it a state. If that word upsets you, use the word corporation. But if you like corporations, just try Blackwater and see how you like living under that. It makes no difference whether it's a corporation, an association, a voluntary group, government, whatever you call it. Whenever you form into groups, and as made very clear in the territorial imperative, the reason I really mentioned that book, all human societies form groups for their mutual defense, regardless of what you call it. It'll always happen. People come together because they want to, they're instinctively driven to it. And in every case, sooner or later, there is a group within that group that you will delegate to protect your life, liberty, and property. And you say, it's okay, we'll put a badge on you, or we'll put the the sword on your shoulder, we'll call you a knight, whatever they do, to give you the authority to use coercion in the defense of life, liberty, or property. I don't care what you call that unit. You better be careful, because they're going to get out of hand if you don't watch them very carefully. So what is the proper function of the state? It's simply to do only those things which are defensive, not aggressive. And those things, you can use violence only for those things that defend our life, liberty, or property. I've reached the end of my message here, and I've got about 40 seconds. And Imani is holding up the flyer there to remind you, if you want to know more about this and many other things that will blow your mind, I hope this one did, don't forget, we have a Red Pill Expo coming up in June 7th, 8th, and 9th in Hartford, Connecticut. Remember, I started off with Hartford, Connecticut. That's where the ice patch was, and poor guy is still there at the tree, probably. Anyway, that's where it is. So come. We'll have these flyers being handed out as you leave. I hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.